I'm going to start off with some good news and some bad news. And I'll mention as well, Kurt talked about, toward the end of his talk, a book by a guy named Daniel Pink, a book called Drive. And Daniel Pink has a few great books, recommended stuff, but a lot of my talk today is actually going to be based around the ideas that he talks about in that. And if you'd like a good introduction to him, if you Google Daniel Pink TED Talk, he has, I think, one of the most 10-watched TED Talks of all time. And he's going to talk about in there some of the introductory ideas and that he goes into that and cover in that book, Drive. But he'll also focus on one of the areas that I'm not going to focus on as much in this talk. So if you're interested, Google that. If you find the talk interesting, would highly recommend his book. It's something I don't think any of it will be specifically revelatory to you in terms of you saying, I didn't know that, but I think it'll make you start to think about some things that you know, but maybe not thinking about how you can actually apply them in your own organizations. And so that's why I think it's a great book, and I'm going to go through a lot of his ideas today. But with that said, I'm going to start off with both some good news and some bad news. The good news is that through numerous tests conducted by scientists, psychologists, economists, management experts, we have a very clear picture of what does and does not motivate employees. If you think about it, motivation is a pretty important topic, and so for good reasons, it's going to be studied about everybody. If you're thinking about athletics, it's going to be studying that. If you're thinking about trying to teach children how to behave or how to accomplish things, if you're thinking about any kind of profession, if you're thinking about economics, if you're thinking about nonprofits, all of these areas are going to be very concerned with motivation, and so for that reason, it's a topic that's been studied for decades. And no matter what facet it's coming from, whether it's being studied from the business side, being studied from the organizational side, being studied from the individual side, the results tend to come back the same. And so for decades, we've had a very clear picture of what does and does not motivate people. The bad news is it's pretty much being ignored. We've had this information around for decades, but if you look at businesses and organizations, although there's no question about what does and does not motivate businesses or motivate people, businesses, for the most part, don't use that information at all in how they manage their employees. And that's interesting because if you go to most businesses and ask them, what is your number one struggle with employees, it's usually going to come back to something like, well, I'm just trying to figure out how to better get them to do their job. And it goes back to motivation. But then this information we have will rarely come into their approaches that they're trying to take. The traditional view, what most businesses would go to, is going to say something along the lines of, well, we usually use compensation as the main way to motivate our employees. And you think about it in your own businesses and the businesses that you've worked with and the businesses that you know. You think about as the owners, as the leaders try to motivate their employees, the number one thing they're probably going to look at is how much should I pay them? How should I pay them? How should that be structured in terms of bonuses and raises and base salary? And in fact, that's probably going to take up about 80 to 90% of their HR time. And yeah, there's some disciplinary measures they're concerned with as well, but those disciplinary measures don't come up nearly as much as compensation itself does. And businesses see, well, this is the way that we're supposed to be motivating people. And they have some logic behind it. We know that we need to incentivize people, and we know that money motivates people, so money would make sense as a motivator. And then that is supported by the fact that we all have personal experiences that we can look back, whether it's ourselves or someone we worked with, where we can go back to many specific cases and say, yeah, money, an offer of money, a promise of reward, did a good job of motivating myself or this other person to go through this task. So we know that money works. At the same time, there are several problems that we don't often think about, but we're kind of aware of, either cognitively or at least subconsciously, that we need to bear in mind if we start to think that compensation is really the only thing we need to be worrying about for motivation. What are those problems? The first one is that incentives themselves tend to change the perception of the task. There's a classic case in literature that probably most of you guys are familiar with, and it's the old Tom Sawyer story. You think about it. You know, Tom Sawyer was given the job to whitewash a fence. What does he do? He wants help whitewashing the fence. He can't afford to hire people, so he's got to convince everybody else that whitewashing the fence is fun. And that's what he does. People are coming along. What do you do? I get to whitewash this fence. Oh, can I help too? It's a game. It's fun. And all of his friends come in and they start helping out. They're not being paid to. They come in with the idea that, yeah, this is something that could actually be fun to do. And by doing so, they're convinced of it. And when they go in with that mindset, as a matter of fact, it seems to bear that out. The problem is, as soon as we start to offer somebody money or start to say, well, here's a reward for doing that task, the immediate assumption is, well, it must not be as much fun. And there's several studies that bear this out, but one of the most interesting ones is when scientists would study children at play. And there's several versions of one, but the one that Daniel Pink goes through in his book is talking about an example of they had observed a classroom. I think it was like a first or second day classroom. And each day, all the kids would have the option to be able to go in their free time and do whatever they wanted to do. And one of the most popular things was for kids to draw. And so they observed the kids that choose each day to draw, and so they decided, well, we're going to go in and we're going to do a test on these children. And they divide the children into 3 groups, although they don't tell them ahead of time that that's what they're doing. And so the next day, as the kids get ready to play, for 1/3 of the kids, they go to them and say, we're going to offer you a prize for whoever does the best job drawing. I think it was just some kind of certificate or something, but some kind of reward for doing the best possible job. Another of the groups, another of the third, they decided that they were going to give a reward, but they didn't tell them about it ahead of time. They just said that they were going to draw for fun, and that was it. But then at the end of it, they actually did give a certificate to a couple of kids who did a really good job. The third group, they neither told that they were going to give them a reward, nor did they actually give them a reward. So 1/3 of them were told ahead of time, you'll get a reward if you do it well. 1/3 were surprised by a reward at the end, and then the other 1/3 got absolutely nothing. So they did that for the day. Then the next day, they observed the kids again to see would they choose to draw again. So the kids that got absolutely no reward, for the most part, went back, and the next day decided to draw again. The kids that were not promised a reward but did get one if they did a good job, almost all of those kids also decided to draw. The kids that had been promised a reward if they did a good job, but then the next day were given absolutely no reward, almost none of them decided to draw. All of a sudden it had become a task to them instead of fun, and as soon as that incentive was taken away, there was no longer any motivation to do it.